The heat sat low and thick over the Colony apartments that Wednesday afternoon, the kind of summer humidity that made the air feel borrowed. Children had been drifting in and out of the parking lot and grassy courtyards all day, finding shade where they could, chasing each other between parked cars and the wide concrete steps leading up to the apartment doors. Morgan Jade Violi was 7 years old and full of the particular energy that belongs only to children in summer. That restless, unstructured joy of having nowhere specific to be and the whole afternoon ahead. She was outside with her sisters and a friend, moving the way children do, not quite playing any one game, but inhabiting the space together, their voices carrying across the lot in bursts of laughter and argument and laughter again. The afternoon felt ordinary. That was the cruelest part of it, how completely ordinary it felt. No one noticed the maroon Chevrolet van until it was already slowing. It rolled into the edge of the parking area with a casual ease that didn't immediately signal danger. Vans came and went. The neighborhood was not unfamiliar with traffic. But something in the van's particular slowness, the way it seemed to be watching rather than arriving, should have been a signal. The driver, a man the children did not know, pulled to a stop and made his first move toward another girl in the group. She pulled away. She ran. In the fraction of a second that followed, the children scattered in instinct, but Morgan was close, too close, and before the moment could be understood, the man had grabbed her. She went into the van fast. The door slid shut. The engine, which had never fully idled down, revved, and the van was moving before anyone had processed what had just happened. Witnesses on the edge of the lot, adults who had been nearby, saw it. The van pulling away with speed, a child gone, the remaining girls standing in stunned silence in the afternoon heat. One woman ran toward the street, trying to read the license plate as the van turned. She got part of it, a partial number, a partial letter, the color, the make. It wasn't enough, but it was something, and she gave it to police when they arrived minutes later, her voice shaking as she pointed in the direction the van had gone. The police came quickly. Bowling Green was not a large city, and the report of a child abduction brought squad cars from multiple directions within minutes of the first call. They fanned out along the roads leading away from the Colony apartments, checking traffic stops, looking for a maroon van, calling in the partial plate. Other officers stayed at the complex, taking statements from the witnesses, from the girls who had been there, trying to piece together a description of a man none of them had seen clearly enough, for long enough, to describe with certainty. Morgan's family was notified. The word went out across the city. By evening, Bowling Green had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that communities change when a child goes missing, when safety becomes conditional, when every parent looks at their own children a little differently before bed. The van was out there somewhere, moving south through the Tennessee summer, and inside it, Morgan Jade Violi was 7 years old and alone. The maroon Chevrolet van had belonged to someone in Dayton, Ohio, a working vehicle, unremarkable, the kind that blends into traffic on any highway in any state. It was reported stolen on July 23, 1996, one day before it appeared in Bowling Green. Its owner woke up that morning to an empty space and called the police, and the report was filed and processed and circulated through the standard channels, one stolen vehicle among many. Robert Scott Froberg had taken it from near his parents' home. He was a man already defined by flight, twice escaped from custody, once from an Alabama correctional facility and once from the Northumberland County Jail in Pennsylvania, a man whose life had become a series of escapes and forward movements, always moving, never arriving anywhere that held him. He was in his early 30s in the summer of 1996. and he had developed the kind of practiced anonymity that comes from years of staying just below the threshold of notice. He drove south from Dayton. The van was functional and anonymous, and full of the particular freedom of stolen things. He crossed into Kentucky without incident, moving through the landscape of small cities and highway stops, and somewhere along the way he decided to pull into Bowling Green. He needed drugs. It was, by his own later account, a simple errand, a stop among stops, a detour in a journey that had no real destination. He did not plan what happened next, or so the story goes. Whether that makes it better or worse is a question that has no useful answer. After the Colony Apartments, after Morgan was in the van, Froberg drove. She was screaming. Of course she was screaming, and he spoke to her. He told her he was taking her to her father. It was a lie chosen for its particular cruelty, the kind of lie that works on a 7-year-old because it offers the one thing fear most wants, a familiar face at the end of the road. Morgan, who did not know this man, who had no reason to believe him and every reason not to, may have quieted somewhat. Children reach for reassurance, even when it comes from the wrong hands. He drove south on I-65, through Bowling Green's outskirts and into the Tennessee countryside. The summer landscape moved past the van's windows, green hills, overpass shadows, the long, flat stretches of Middle Tennessee. He pulled off somewhere near White House, a small community north of Nashville, where a barn sat at the edge of a property bordered by woods. He stopped there. What happened next, Froberg described 30 decades later in a prison interview with federal agents, in flat language that the Department of Justice would later include in criminal charging documents. He used a handkerchief. The van was still. The barn was quiet. The woods beyond it were dense and private in the way that rural Tennessee can be private. Not because no one lives there, but because the land absorbs things. He left her in the woods. He drove to a dumpster and disposed of her clothing. Then he drove the van to Franklin, Tennessee, and left it at a truck stop, walked away from it, and disappeared back into the country he had been moving through for years. The van sat at that truck stop for 2 days before investigators found it. It was processed, searched, documented. A strand of hair was recovered from the interior. A fiber was noted. The evidence was cataloged and stored, because that is what investigators do. They hold on to everything, even when everything leads nowhere, even when the case goes cold and the years begin to pass. The hair waited 30 years to tell its story. Autumn comes differently in Middle Tennessee than it does farther north, slower, more reluctant, the trees holding their green longer than they should before finally giving in to yellow and rust and the particular amber of late October afternoons. By the time Morgan's remains were found on October 20th, 1996, nearly 3 months had passed since her disappearance. The search had never stopped, but it had spread thin across the geography of uncertainty. She was found in the wooded area near the barn in White House, Tennessee, the same place Froberg had left her in July. The woods had held her through the summer heat and into autumn, and by the time investigators arrived, what remained were her skeletal remains, a discovery that confirmed what many had feared, but that the family had perhaps still been holding some small hope against. The Warren County investigation merged with federal jurisdiction in the formal, procedural way these cases do when remains are found across state lines from the original crime. The FBI was involved. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation was involved. Medical examiners came. Evidence technicians processed the scene with the careful, methodical patience of people trained to find meaning in things that weather and time have tried to erase. In Morgan's hair, investigators found a fiber. It was small and easy to overlook, the kind of detail that only matters if you know what you're looking for, or know enough to save everything and look harder later. The fiber was collected, documented, and sent to the lab. At the time, it could not be definitively matched to a specific source, but it was there, preserved in the evidence record, waiting. Back in Bowling Green, the news reached the community in the way that confirmation of the worst always does, not as a surprise exactly, because 3 months had passed and hope had been fraying, but as a finality that surprise cannot fully describe. The colony apartments were quieter now. Children still played outside, because life continues, but the parents watched differently, and the neighborhood held the kind of communal awareness that comes from having been the location of something terrible. Morgan's family faced the specific, unnavigable grief of parents and siblings who have received the answer to a question they needed answered and wished with everything in them had remained unanswered. There is no way to describe that grief adequately from the outside. There is no language that contains it. The investigation continued. Detectives worked the evidence they had, the partial license plate, the witness descriptions, the forensic materials recovered from the van and the scene. They followed leads, they interviewed people, they submitted requests and waited for responses and followed those threads too. None of it led to a name. None of it led to Froberg, who was not in any database they were checking, who had moved on, who was living somewhere in the country under the particular invisibility of someone who is wanted but not yet known to be wanted for this. The case file grew, and then it stopped growing, and then it sat. The community held a memorial. Morgan's name was spoken at vigils and in churches and in the quiet conversations of families who remembered that summer. Her absence became part of the texture of Bowling Green in the way that certain losses do, not forgotten, but carried, folded into the ongoing life of a place that has learned to hold its grief alongside everything else. 30 years is a long time to carry something. The Violi family carried it anyway. There is a particular kind of patience required of physical evidence. It does not grow restless. It does not lose faith. A strand of hair recovered from a stolen van in 1996 does not know that it is evidence, does not know that it is waiting, does not experience the passage of 30 years the way the people connected to the case do. It simply exists, preserved in a labeled container in a climate-controlled evidence storage facility, carrying its information intact, waiting for technology to catch up to what it knows. By the early 2020s, DNA analysis had changed so fundamentally from what was available in 1996 that evidence collected in that era could be re-examined with tools that might as well have been science fiction to the investigators who first processed it. Familial DNA searching, forensic genealogy, next-generation sequencing, techniques that had been developed, refined, and deployed to solve cases that had seemed permanently closed. Cold case units across the country had begun systematically retesting old evidence with new methods, reopening files that had sat untouched for decades. The FBI's forensic team retested the hair recovered from the interior of the stolen maroon van. This was careful, precise work, the kind that requires controlling for contamination across 30 years of handling, accounting for degradation, working with material that may have compromised over time, and coaxing from it whatever genetic information remains. The technicians who did this work were following a process, but they were also following a hope that somewhere in that strand of hair was a profile clean enough to run, complete enough to mean something. It was. The DNA profile that emerged from the retested hair was clear enough to enter into the federal database, clear enough to search against. And somewhere in that search, it matched. Not to Morgan, not to any witness or investigator who had handled the van, but to Robert Scott Froberg, a man whose DNA was in the system because of his prior criminal history, a man who had been in and out of the correctional system across multiple states for decades. His name had never appeared in the Morgan Violi case file. He had never been interviewed, never been on a list of suspects, never been on the FBI's radar in connection with this crime. He was, in the most literal sense, unknown to the investigation, a ghost in the case, present only in a single strand of hair that had been waiting in an evidence box for 30 years. When the match came back, investigators pulled everything connected to Froberg, his criminal history, his escape records, his timeline. A twice-escaped inmate in the summer of 1996, in Ohio near his parents' home, where the van was stolen in late July, moving south. The timeline aligned, the geography aligned, and then there was the fiber, the one collected from Morgan's hair at the recovery site in October 1996, the one that had been documented and filed and never definitively sourced. Investigators matched it to the seat cushions of the stolen van. Two pieces of evidence collected 30 years apart in time, but connected in origin, both pointing to the same man sitting in an Alabama prison. The case was no longer cold. The Alabama prison where Robert Scott Froberg was serving time is the kind of institution defined by routine. The same rhythms, the same sounds, the same institutional light falling through the same windows at the same angles every day. Froberg had been inside long enough to know its patterns, to have become part of them. He was 62 years old in February 2026, and whatever he had been in the summer of 1996, the man who drove a stolen van south from Ohio, who stopped in Bowling Green, who made the choices he made, that man had been buried under decades of incarceration and time. The federal agents who came to interview him on February 24 had done this before. They had sat across tables from people who had been carrying terrible things for a long time, and they knew that the conversation could go many ways. They had the DNA, they had the fiber match, they had enough to charge him regardless of what he said in that room. But they came anyway, because a confession is not just evidence, it is an accounting, and the Violi family had waited 30 years for someone to account. What happened in that room, what was said, how it began, whether Froberg showed any particular emotion or none at all, is known only to those present. What the Department of Justice later documented was the substance of what he admitted, that he had stopped in Bowling Green to buy drugs, that he had taken Morgan from the Colony Apartments, that he had told her he was taking her to her father in the moments when she was screaming in the van, that he had strangled her with a handkerchief near a barn in White House, Tennessee, that he had left her body in the woods, that he had thrown her clothing in a dumpster and driven the van to Franklin and abandoned it. He had been carrying this for 30 years. He had watched the world change around him from inside various correctional institutions, had perhaps read or heard references to unsolved child abduction cases, had lived with the knowledge of what he had done in the particular way that people live with things they believe will never catch them. And then, two federal agents sat down across from him and laid out what forensic science had assembled in his absence. And whatever he decided in that moment, whether it was exhaustion or the recognition that denial was pointless or something else entirely, he told them what had happened to Morgan Jade Violi. The charging documents were filed. Froberg was transferred into federal custody. The charges carried only two possible penalties: life imprisonment or death. In Bowling Green, the news reached the Violi family after 30 years of living without an answer. The community that had mourned Morgan in 1996, that had held vigils and memorials and carried her absence through decades of ordinary life, learned that the man who had taken her had a name and a face and was now in federal custody. Local officials and law enforcement spoke about the breakthrough publicly, about the power of forensic science, about the importance of never closing a case. None of it brings Morgan back. None of it repairs the 30 years. But in a conference room in an Alabama prison, on an unremarkable February day in 2026, someone finally said what had happened to Morgan Jade Violi. And that accounting, however late, however incomplete, belonged now to the people who had been waiting for it the longest.